Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Friday, October 4th. This is the second Friday SLO talk of the 2024 fall semester. My name is Jarek Janio. I'm the founder of the Friday SLO Talks, and I am also joined by my colleagues from community colleges in California, Enrique and Alicia. If you could please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Enrique Jauregui. I am the SLO coordinator for Fresno City College, located in the Central Valley of California. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I am Alicia Betancourt. I am the faculty assessment coordinator at San Diego City College in San Diego. And we are all excited down here for our Padres to be advancing. So welcome.
All right. Good morning again. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, coaches, for joining us, for making it happen. We have two fantastic presenters to start us off this morning. We are going to talk about assessing experiential learning and then maximizing the impact of assessment. And those are topics that are of great interest to all of us, those who are attending the SLO talks. Then the second part is we are going to talk about assessment of experiential learning in higher education with a different speaker. But before we let speakers introduce themselves, I just would like to remind you that we are all about interaction. So please don't hesitate to engage in the chat. We have the question and answer feature, I believe. It's activated as well. So please don't hesitate to ask questions via chat. If you would like to speak, raise your hand, let one of the coaches know, and we'll let you unmute yourself and ask the question or make the comment. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Bill Heinrich and Dr. Patrice Ludwig. Here we are. Please, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Janio. It's great to be here. It's nice to see some familiar names and faces and lots of new people to me. So I'm glad to get to know you through this work.
I echo that. As an assessment enthusiast, I'm very happy to be here with you all.
So we're here to talk about assessing experiential learning in higher education. We're going to do kind of a big funnel to a little funnel. We're going to take a top to bottom ecosystem approach. You're going to hear that term a lot. It's driven by some new and some recent research, this conversation. So we're lots of citations for you, lots of tangible examples for you. I know we're sharing these slides afterwards, if not now already, so you can see and grab the screens as you see fit. Again, my name is Bill Heinrich, and I'm the director of Mindset at Simplicity, which is a software company. I serve there as a subject matter expert because I'm trained in higher education and assessment, specifically in experiential learning. Before that, I worked in student affairs. I was at University of California in Santa Cruz, managing residence halls for a bunch of years before continuing my education at Michigan State University in higher ed, and then working for the provost on some projects around experiential learning and assessment in that capacity before this role.
And I share Bill's outdoor experience, but not in the same way. I was trained as a population ecologist. That's what my discipline is by training. I taught in the biology department at James Madison University for a long time and taught first-year students, and was always really curious about whether anything I was doing was actually working. And so I backed into being an assessment enthusiast, chairing our committee, and then expanding my space into our innovation space on campus, which is called JMU X Labs, where I spent some time there. And that propelled me into my current position as an interim assistant vice president in research, economic development, and innovation.
So we want to think about you. We want to think about you as our audience, and we really want you to think about your role in experiential learning and assessment in particular, because as we've got into this conversation in our current research, what we started to see was the term experiential learning used a lot. It was used at the level of courses and classrooms and pedagogy and co-curricular education. It was used in reports around quality and oversight and goodness about the institution. It was used in strategic plans and by different people at different roles. So we really want to think about that right now. So I imagine a lot of you are educators and maybe learners, but you're interacting with learners, right? Instructors and teachers who engage in this learning process, that's experiential learning potentially.
Until about 3:30.
There's also folks.
Or 9503 if you feel like using a phone, or I'll send you a message as well. Thanks, bye.
Sorry, I don't know who it was. I can mute people, I just can't tell who it was this time, sorry.
Oh, there. I was able to unmute. Is that okay?
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Great. Sorry for that interruption. We also want to speak to you as administrators. You might be a dean, director, chair. You might be a provost or a vice provost or a vice president. All of your roles, people who organize, support, consume data, and otherwise interact with experiential learning, throughout the institution. We also want to talk to employers, external stakeholders, community members, legislators, folks who worry about the kinds of students who are coming out, the kinds of education they're receiving from our institution. So these are all stakeholders that we identified in our research. They all use the same two words, experiential learning. They tend to mean different things. And that's going to be an important message we send here today. So find your role, think about that as you're thinking about the terms, and we're going to break that down in a couple different ways as we go forward.
So listening to that list, you can imagine that we would expect to see interactions at an institutional level. And so this you might have seen before. Berger and Milam it's a model, famous model for kind of how higher education works. A group that I was part of modified that model to add faculty, and by faculty, we mean broadly anybody that's directly interacting with students in a learning capacity. And so if I walk you through this, if we start at the student and faculty entry characteristics, there are attributes of students and faculty, employees of a university that attract them to that space. I'm going to use university broadly. That might mean a college, that might be online, that might be physical. So these entry characteristics actually help shape an institutional vibe, is the best way to describe it right now. And that's in that blue box. And there are bi-directional arrows here because they're all influencing, each of these attributes are intervening and influencing each other. So our entering students and our entering faculty and our entering staff are creating some organizational characteristics. Those organizational characteristics are co-influencing how faculty and staff and students are interacting in their peer groups and then with each other. And then all of that is influencing the experiences that everyone is having on campus. That could be an academic experience, that could be a social experience, that could be a functional experience. And all of those things wrapped up together are influencing student and faculty outcomes. And we added faculty outcomes because they're an essential part of the mix, and they directly and maybe overrepresentative effect on student outcomes. So these interactions are driving what we're seeing, and you can imagine this, maybe through my lens as an ecologist, you can imagine this as populations interacting, right? So there's a population of students that are interacting, and they've got their own dynamics, and a population of instructors that are interacting, and they've got their own dynamics. And when those populations mix, a new set of dynamics emerge. So we're going to introduce this complexity as an ecosystem. And Bill, I think you have a few other things to say about this as well.
Yeah, what's really interesting is to see the interaction, because consistently in our interviews, we hear from faculty and other educators about how experiential learning benefits them, even after having done extra work to design and plan and implement. There's a feeling of benefit, and that's a really important idea, because especially if you're a dean, director, or chair, we need to think about rewards and incentives for the amount of work that is involved with any of our education. And then, you know, what do we do with that? How do we plan for that? All of that. So it's good to see this kind of organizational model evolve from, you know, unidirectional to multi-directional spaces like that. I think it acknowledges a lived reality that we're seeing in our research.
And then when you start thinking about this from an assessment capacity, we're going to introduce a challenge here. And that challenge is, and Bill, if you want to go forward.
Yeah.
That challenge is both I would say a challenge and an asset, is complexity. So when we have this kind of these interactions and all of these populations working, we really need to think about the student learning outcomes. And it's kind of, I guess, traditional or typical to think about, like, what are the knowledge and the skills that are generated in those spaces. We got to get beyond that, because in experiential learning, for both all the learners, and I'm including faculty, staff in this group as well, is like, there are affective and career and engagement outcomes that we're not always capturing. So this idea of all of these interactions generating complexity is both a challenge, but a huge asset, opening up the space for assessment in so many different capacities. And then the indirect impacts of that are also incredible, that we'll see in a little bit. We come at this because whenever you simplify, or whenever anyone simplifies something, you necessarily lose nuance. Like, that's just the point of simplification. And we are really worried about that from an equity standpoint. So we've all kind of heard and we buy into the fact that high impact practices among, EL is one of those. They level the playing field for student success. They create equitable learning spaces. And if you simplify too far, you lose the ability to pull that information out and to give those opportunities to students. So we're trying to pull out, well, actually in the classroom, students are learning durable skills like engagement, like interpersonal skills, like empathy and professional and applied skills, problem solving, critical thinking. All of this is happening in those spaces. So as we think about holistic student learning outcomes and making them available to the whole ecosystem, let's just say employers for our case now, we improve the impacts for students in terms of employer recruiting. So not thinking, if we simplify too far and we don't attend to this holistic sense, then we're doing a disservice and potentially excluding candidates from minoritized, marginalized, and underserved groups. So this complexity is opportunity as well.
We want to talk about that complexity, start to break it down in our next slide. So we started to identify a foundational level of experiential learning. And this is probably the most complex part of it in terms of just distribution and diversity. Here's a sample. This is by no means exhaustive of the kinds of experiential learning that might be available on your campus. In our research, we identified 35 types of experiential learning with literatures, with background to support them. So we can share that list later, but there's a lot going on is our point. That's the point here. Like, you might be doing 1 or 2 or 3 of these, but your peers are doing other kinds and other approaches, which makes a lot of sense because they were trained in biology or you were trained in engineering. The experiential learning in those fields is different. There's literatures to back up why those are different. You might be doing study abroad, or you might be doing first-year experiences. Again, different literature bases get us into those practices. We tend to lump them together in organizations and call that experiential learning. And so we need to be conscientious that our peers are doing it slightly differently and maybe from a different epistemology, and that's okay. We're not here to tell anyone how to do that part of their job. We want to show you that it's part of an ecosystem, but we recognize there's a lot of good work happening and a lot of interesting work happening in this space at this foundational across the institution kind of level. We often, though, in institutions, back to the moving from pedagogy to organizations, we often organize ourselves in departments and units that have deans, directors, or chairpersons, right? And so we have these bosses who care about the work we do. They care about it in particular ways in terms of scheduling, reward structures, program enrollment, making the budgets work and things like that, right? So again, experiential learning means something different when you're planning for it at a program level than when you're planning for it at a course level or at an education program level, right? So we need to talk about, again, the differences and the roles we play, which is why we talked about roles a little earlier. We also know that the vice presidents, vice provosts, vice presidents, students tend to think about experiential learning differently. Patrice, you are one. Would you talk about that, please?
Yes. I'm new to this, so I will talk about it from a very newly minted AVP role. I was in the trenches. I came from a faculty space where I was doing this stuff. In my new capacity, I'm thinking of, number one, how do I support these programs? And so I'm thinking of like, what are those long-term or impactful spaces where I can both externally talk about, oh, when we engage in these kinds of classes or these kinds of experiences, here's what it does for the institution or at the institutional level. So I'm talking about the benefits in both spaces and trying to figure out how to generate excitement and external stakeholders to buy into this so that we can support it further.
And of course, after our VPs and vice provosts, we have the president and the provost, the executives, who are largely interested in two kinds of communication. The first one is external. They're telling the story of the institution to our external stakeholders, legislators, parents, families, employers, the local community, where depending on where you're situated, you might have a local community partner, different placement partners for volunteer and other academic experiences. There's lots of partners. The other thing the president and the provost are doing are setting the priority for the institution internally around, in our research, experiential learning. Sometimes they're not setting that priority, right? So, and that's a message we might also hear, and gives a sense of how things are valued on your particular campus. But and we'll talk about trends in a few moments. But in general, we're starting to see this large picture as this experiential learning ecosystem that is both broad and foundational at its base, and become narrow and a little more unified as you travel up the organizational chart or up the food chain, depending on your point of view. So there's definitely a set of interactions and a set of opportunities that happen when folks talk about experiential learning, and they understand the other layers and understand how the work is being done in the other parts of the institution. And that's a really important set of ideas here. There's a note here. Patrice, can you share your learner educator experiences with transformative change with the VP level? I think we'll have an opportunity to do that along the way. Some relevant trends we saw in our research about the experiential learning ecosystem. So the leaders of experiential learning on campuses are naming lots of pressures that are driving these decisions on their campuses. These should be fairly familiar, but students and their families want value. Employers are looking for well-qualified job candidates. Legislatures are looking at the effectiveness of our institutions. There are cost issues, floating around depending on how we price our educational experiences. Public perception is a big question mark these days. All drivers of some of the decisions around experiential learning. Across to the right of your screen, what we see are a lot of emergent experiential learning offices, and then leaders appointed to lead these offices, which is kind of a new role on campus, which is an interesting thing. So we see these portfolios of experiential learning aggregated into this experiential learning office. Now, there's lots of different names. We're using EL as a broad term, but we've seen applied learning, active learning, immersive learning, transformative learning, all in the names and the titles. We're not going to quibble about that today. Those are important ideas on your campus, and please figure that out. That being said, some of the things that are happening are, we've seen a lot of high impact practices, build on research, build on good practice, aggregating into a portfolio of experiential learning. So the portfolios tend to look like study abroad, plus undergraduate education, plus learning communities, plus a few other things. And then the question becomes, what is the definition or taxonomy of experiential learning? And how do we count things, or how do we count the outcomes? And that's a key question for these leaders. Another big layer of the emergent offices are who's stewarding the priorities. The executive usually is driving with like, hey, rah, experiential learning, we're gonna go in this direction. This is gonna be a thing. We see this a lot in strategic plans, and emerging from strategic plans. And we see a fair number of campuses, depending on their accreditation cycle, use their QEP or quality enhancement plan to build out an experiential learning set. And that will have a specific shape and character on the given campus. So there's nuances there. Yeah. Good. I'm glad these visuals are hard. Thanks, Bree, for the note. Yeah, if you're watching the comments, it is hard to talk about disjointed units and divisions, which is a big part of this investigation. So glad that's helping. But yeah, these are some of the trends. And then on campus, we're facing sustainability questions, like how do we sustain a new office? And a lot of that might have to do with data, like what data do we report and to whom and who cares? And we're going to get into that in some detail here. Quality, what does it mean to have quality? How do we recognize students and faculty and other educators for the work of experiential learning? Do we care? Where might we recognize that? And then in sort of an attention economy, like what aren't we doing if we're doing more experiential learning? Like, or what might compete with experiential learning? Is it the football team? I don't know where you're at, but there's been some changes in conferences. So there's some other things that grab students' attention that this might compete with, because these kinds of things take people off campus. They take people into work sites or into field experiences more frequently, and that's a good idea in principle. But there are costs to that. So again, things we saw in the data around the trends. Now we're gonna shift gears a little bit, and we're gonna get we're at that high level, kind of the broad part of the funnel. We're gonna get narrow now down to the pedagogy. So at the pedagogical level, experiential learning, again, shifting gears, same term. We're talking about theory now, operates generally as a process learning theory. There's a really good reference here from Engstrom and Senino around process learning theories that helps you describe it. What I'm doing here, and somebody mentioned Dewey in the chat, Dewey is underlying a lot of this. A friend of mine who studies philosophy of experiential ed says, the people who can write about Dewey are the best ones, are the ones who can conjure Dewey. And so Dewey's a little bit hard to read sometimes. But some of these theorists have read Dewey and developed learning theories based on them. So starting in 1970 instead of 1940 with this list. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but I want you to see that there's a lot of ways to do this. There's a lot of epistemology, a lot of theorizing in the background, and a fair amount of empirical work built on top of these theories. So pick your approach. All of them have a reflective component, and an experiential component, something to do and something to reflect on. Barring the similarities then differ. All of these are process learning theories. There's steps in a process to get some, from where you start to where you hope students end up. So that's what's common here. Again, this is more of a bibliography and a reference list than us getting into a theoretical debate, but they operate same but different. Again, I'm not, as a generalist and thinking about the ecosystem, I expect that these would operate differently in different spaces. That's good and useful in this broader conversation.
I'm going to pick up on that theme, but also drill down a little bit from Bill's perspective in this theoretical space. When I come at it from a really applied moment by moment space, for me as a biologist, thinking about how students, and myself included, and the learner is showing up, is experiential learning just seems to make sense in delivering the most bang for my buck. So if we think about these 6 brain-based designed principles activating learning in a space, when we have experiential learning, we're engaging the entire learning cycle. So I'm just going to continue to use Kolb. That's the one I'm most familiar with. I backed into that, and so I'm comfortable there. But we're making time for reflection in Kolb, and then part of that cycle, and so that reflection is happening in we're activating our temporal lobe. And I will say that I am not an expert in this space, but I am a user of this information. So this seems to make sense for me as a model for helping me design my courses. When we think about now going from reflection to creating something, to making something, which is where I like to spend a lot of time, we're now engaging a different part of our brain. So this is, we're using our whole, well, much more of our brain than maybe me just sitting here lecturing to you. What I also love about this is that we're asking a learner to start with something that they know as a scaffold and add on to it. So maybe the new learning sticks a little bit more. They're adding to that, and they're growing and evolving their knowledge of a particular space. Oftentimes in my experiential learning kind of experiences, these are they're in teams or in groups a lot of times, or there's at least a social component to that. And that part of it gives another entryway for the content for the person, for the learner, so they have another way to access what they learned in a different context. One of the things that I love about this is that there's both a feeling and a thinking component. And one of the things that I'm noticing, I have a student, a daughter who just started college, and we've been working on not on emotional arguments versus like rational or logical arguments, and experiencing both of the emotions or the feelings and the logic and the knowledge in the same space, but then being able to separate them is actually really helpful for her to understand, oh, I'm reacting emotionally, or no, this is a logical argument that I'm choosing to make. Again, we talked about the attention economy. Like we're finding that in this whole brain kind of space, we're teaching our students to hang on a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer. And maybe that goes for the instructors too. And then again, like think of all the senses we've engaged when we're doing experiential learning. Think about a student doing undergraduate research, and they're working with their hands and they're manipulating things, and they're also smelling things as they're doing it, and there's sounds in the lab. And so we're increasing what they're hanging on that scaffold and all the access points to new information. So for me as a practitioner, I love what this does. This is a really good grounding point for me and how the students are learning and how I'm designing my experiences.
Yeah. So yeah, lots of theory, lots of context and data to help you start your design work. So let's go deeper into one of these process theories. Again, David Kolb's experiential learning cycle came out first in 1984. The reason I'm using Kolb among that whole list, it got a lot of traction among that list. It's been cited in every discipline I can find, hundreds and hundreds of spaces, over 88,000 times. This theory has been used and described. So there's lots of data, lots of description around the use of this in different kinds of areas. So it's pretty broadly applicable. It does start from a standpoint, it comes out of management and organizational psychology. So it does have, a point of view for better or worse, right? You want to be aware of the point of view of the theories you're using. Kolb tends to start with a concrete experience at the top of this four-part cycle, moves to a reflective observation, where educators are prompting learners to reflect on what just happened in the experience in light of their other experiences in life. Or that's fundamentally a very culturally inclusive opportunity to reflect this way. It's one of the reasons that experiential learning can be so inclusive and can be an equalizer of educational outcomes, is because people bring themselves to the learning in that moment of reflection. The abstract conceptualization, this tends to be where we make sense of the experience and the reflection in terms of the course topic or the book learning or what would be a lecture. If we only lecture, which would be fine, this is kind of where we're operating in this abstracted sort of aggregated space. It's not quite a lived experience, but it's received as a body of knowledge. Again, perfectly fine to do a good lecture. Don't take this the wrong way, but it's part of the experiential learning cycle. And then that's followed by active experimentation, where learners are taking what they learned and applying it to the next thing. And that could be the next part of the foundational biology course, where they take the first principle and apply it to the second principle. It could be they take a deliverable from a project-based interdisciplinary program and deliver it in a live presentation to a third party, the local library who asked for some help with a project. So it could be different kinds of stakes or different kinds of outcome. And the scale varies greatly, like I said before.
Well, Amanda's got her hand up. Do you want to?
Oh yeah, who's got her hand up? Amanda.
Me.
Yeah,
and you might get to this in your presentation. I just wanted to put the bug in the air because I know many others like me are probably on the question is this type of such powerful learning is I'm sure going to generate a lot of data for the instructor to process. How do we manage that? So I had a feeling you were getting to it. I just wanted to put a plug in there just in case.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Amanda.
Great.
That's an excellent question. Yes, it can generate a lot of data, and whether or not, let's talk about that actually. So we generally collect this data here at the bottom. We call it a grade. We call it an evaluation. This is where we give feedback. It's usually in the space that we design learning outcomes and competencies, and those skills are developed or competencies are developed. We often record that or name that as a graduation or an academic goal and record that on a grade report, which leads to an academic transcript. So directly to your point, Amanda, this is the kind of data we already do. One of the key questions that got us into this work is this: where do these parts get assessed? And do we pay attention to that? So yes, there are potentially, thanks for anticipating that, 3 more kinds of assessment data available. And I'm really glad Will Miller is on the call. I saw the abstract for your talk coming after. I think you're going to get into this a little more directly with some great examples. So we're going to operate at sort of a conceptual level, and I'll let Will get into the weeds on that program. So thanks for jumping on screen there, but just shout out. So hang on for the second hour. I think it'll dovetail right here. But yeah, that's a big question. It's generally, if you do the whole cycle and you only assess the one layer of that outcome, you're probably under recognizing experiential learning for your class, your student, and maybe your campus. Patrice is going to talk about, though, before we're going to get to a model of how we might think about that, Amanda, where to put that data. But we have to talk about, because this is the SLO talks, we really want to focus on the details of assessing experiential learning in a course. Here are some examples. Patrice is going to walk us through these parts.
Thank you, Bill. So a little context. I mentioned this space, this innovation space earlier. It's called JMU X Labs. We host a lot of different classes. I'm showing you 2 arcs, 2 ways that different instructors have designed the arc of a semester course in this space. So on one side, you see medical innovations, and on the other side, you see a course that's dedicated to problems associated with the Internet of Things. Those are not important. What I want you to see is they look really different. They are organized very differently. These are both experiential learning spaces. And so there's lots of ways that you can approach the organization of your semester that when you're designing the course. So thinking about that, thinking about student learning outcomes, we've always taken the tact of this holistic space. And so a lot of our activities are in that holistic space. So I'm going to start, I'm just going to leave that there. You're going to get that. You can screenshot it. You can see it later on. But phases and themes are these 2 kinds of organizing structures. So if we move to now assessing this, you can imagine that I'm talking about like when we think about, and Bill, you can advance it. I'm going to go through that table.
Sure.
So I'm going to talk about maybe some knowledge. All right. And so knowledge shows up in different ways. One of the ways that Bill said that we can assess knowledge is those traditional ways that you get a grade for. And you might think of that like maybe like an exam or something like that. In these X Labs experiential learning classrooms that are cross-disciplinary and very engaging, we decided that all the students were coming in at different levels and different backgrounds, and we could not figure out how to assess knowledge in a standardized way. So we landed on reflection as the way that we were going to move through assessment. And in that case, our artifacts were exactly what you see here. Every week, we asked a student to produce 2 moments of learning, an observation, 2 moments, 2 observations of their own learning. And then we also landed on interviews instead of exams with standardized questions that they could tell us what they were learning. when we did that, what we were looking for is we were looking for how they were thinking about the problems that they were solving. We were looking for evolution in their critical thinking and whether they were borrowing tools from each other. We were looking for them to stand in their discipline and be the representative and own that disciplinary knowledge as they were sharing it on their team. We codified that in a portfolio system called the Learning Record that we borrowed and modified from folks at UT Austin. And that has served us really well because it's evidence-based and students are telling us what and how they learned, and it's worked really well. So that's a lot of text data, but it ends up being really easy for us to assess. It's nice and clear. If I take, we can also assess that knowledge through the deliverables. So we can look at what they made and figure out how much they learned about the problem that they were trying to solve. And, you know, at the end of the day, did they solve it or not? Like, were they able to get there or not? When we think about like this kind of active experimentation assessment, that's coded on this slide as activity. I think about it as how often are the students trying something and pivoting. In my case, that might look different for you. And so I see that through how well they're engaging with their team, with the instructors, and then with the external partners, if there are some. So I'm looking at how well they're engaging in the network. That also tells me a lot about that network analysis can tell me if students are silencing each other, if there is a student who is over contributing and trying to dominate a conversation, we'll be able to see that. We can tell how many students are bringing in new ideas from external sources by how often they're engaging in their network external to their peers. And I can see there's a visual representation. It doesn't give the complete picture of collaboration, but it does give me how many interactions are happening. And I see that in their deliverables. So I know, and this is a hunch, this is not a tested theory or by any stretch of the imagination, but the students that are in teams that are engaging in Taco Tuesday and going bowling have way better end results than the students that are just there for class. And we see it time and time again. I can point to that anecdotally year after year. And my hunch is that they're building the kind of trust that moves them through the really sticky parts of their projects and the parts that could derail the whole team. They now trust each other when they get there and they move through that cycle faster. And then get to this solution that we're all like, this is amazing. So all of these individual parts of these experiences are awesome, and they're happening in a classroom in an isolated experience. So the question then is, how do you take all of those amazing moments across an institution and this qualitative data and this network data and translate that up in some sort of coordinated fashion to people that sit in offices like me at this point? And so I think it's important that we all recognize that every institution has effectively like a theory of change that they're using or a logic model. And so the educators, the instructors at one level are using a tool called experiential learning, and we see the amazing benefits of that. The resources associated with that's financial, that's time, that's humans, that's all of the things that you might imagine that are going into these experiences. So then from my perspective, where I sit and then I advocate up is like, all right, what's an output here? I see students and faculty re-engaged in my university in a way that I could not have anticipated. That's a holistic outcome that I couldn't have gotten from the sum of the parts. I also see them working on real world problems and a renewed sense of purpose in what they're doing, or developing a sense of purpose that they might not have had before. And then I can translate that into one of those big institutional outcomes where we can talk about our students developing a sense of belonging and feeling at home at our university, which is going to lead to better retention numbers.
Yeah, Enrique, you have a question?
Yes, this is wonderful. This is great, Patrice and Bill. Just a quick question, and you have this experimental learning, theories and what have you, and it's like, how do we ensure that this rich experiences is actually leading to meaningful assessments, and how do you combine them together?
How do you ensure that it leads to meaningful assessment?
Can I ask a clarifying question about your question?
Yes.
At what level of assessment? So we're assessing kind of student level outcomes. We can assess faculty level outcomes, or do you mean
At the student level?
At the student level? So I would say from the student level, we're looking at text data and matching and that's what the portfolio does. The student has to provide evidence that they've achieved the course objectives and 6 dimensions of learning. And we have to see evidence that they have done that. So they have to provide that to us. So that's how we do it.
Yeah. And with all respect, that's a really big question. And it's also a kind of a disciplinary or field-based question. And so I want to just kick back to an earlier slide where I mentioned 35 types of experiential education literature based in disciplines and fields in specific areas like chemistry education or teacher education or engineering education that have a version of experiential learning as part of the pedagogy. So I would refer each of you to your own discipline or your disciplinary areas for this to answer this well. I don't pretend to be an expert in all of those areas. I just know they exist. I keep bumping into them. People say, what's the definition? I'm like, well, it depends where you sit when you think about the definition of quality. So again, I don't want to avoid your question, but I also not sure we have time to answer it for everyone here in depth. So yeah, take Alicia, you have a question?
Well, I'm just, 35 is a very large number.
Yeah.
So you may be getting to this. How can we make this a little bit more practical or for us to?
I'm so glad you asked.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're right. So this logic model, I want to make clear, comes from a paper by Ashley Finley, a NILOA paper, which is a really useful resource. It's cited there from 2019. That's a really useful paper for thinking about assessing more complex experiences. It drove a lot of my thinking around getting into this project, and then led us through the data to this model. So Alicia, to your point or to your question, here's an aggregate model from our interview data about how assessment of experiential learning moves through our environments we call institutions. So again, we have Kolb in the middle as an example of a process theory. We've talked about how it works. Kolb delivers certain kinds of activities and experiences in learning or through that kind of cycle, depending on your area. So let's start with the concrete experience. What's happening there is an experience, which is a kind of engagement. And we know that students engaged and active in their learning is a big part of attachment, ultimately helping them develop purpose and a sense of belonging. We know that from engagement literature. If we back that out, if we zoom out one more level to the institution, we know that a sense of belonging and purpose leads to student retention and ultimately student success. And so if we look at a cohort of people who've gone through an experiential learning cycle in a class or a program, we can start to track that kind of belonging that develops over time and start to track how that leads to, or doesn't, to student success on your campus. We know it should work. Again, this is the theory. Whether or not it does on your campus is a fair question. There's a lot of intermediate variables, but our participants in our interview data talked about this as an idea. Let's follow that pattern over to reflective observation. The act of reflection builds self-awareness and empathy about one's own experience, empathy for oneself and for others, and emotional intelligence about how those experiences happen. When we look at the broader outcomes, that looks a lot like student development literature, student development outcomes and holistic learning outcomes. So our student development folks, you're in this, right? We're doing leadership training. We're doing intercultural development training. It's happening on study abroad. It's happening in learning communities, but this is what's going on. So we can look for this kind of data there in that kind of reflection signal. Like Patrice said, they assessed reflections for knowledge, but also for other kinds of outcomes. We talked about where learning outcomes tend to get delivered in a class or kind of experience. They tend to get recorded on grades. And then in the active experimentation phase, what we see are behaviors like teamwork and problem solving and deliverables and presentations as part of the experimentation, which look a lot like work readiness and applied skills, which when we back out to the institutional value, we can say things with data now about career readiness. And so if we think about each data point as having impact on students and programs, but as well as information about the institution for the institution to use, then we can think about this data model. Now, this is aggregate. This is sort of generalized. All models are wrong. Some are useful as we understand models. So we need to fill in our own language. Like I said, some places call it applied or active learning or different names. I'm not trying to say this is what you have to call it. I'm trying to say we're looking for these signals in our course level and education level assessment, as Patrice described, and then we can talk about them and how they are understood in the institution as something that's valuable. So if the president's going to say, we value experiential learning, they might be saying, we value reflection. They might be saying, we value career readiness. They might be saying, we value academic success. All of those could be true with experiential learning, but we want to be specific and we want to know what's going on internally to make that claim. So this really gets us to from a concrete, from theory to assessment to sort of an ecosystem view of this institution as a container for experiential learning. We might, as part of an assessment conversation, we might have questions about where to record or where to write it down or how to record it. So we want to add this. Again, we have Kolb in the middle. We have our student outcomes in that blue ring, and we might record these outcomes in different areas. So engagement, purpose, and belonging and student retention data tends to get reported at unit reports and institutional research, right? Not, again, aggregating. We might record empathy and self-awareness and emotional intelligence in something like a co-curricular record. That's the CCR term, right? We might also badge any of these things. So if you're into badging or micro recognition or intermittent recognition, there's lots of language for it, but badges might be helpful for this. If you see a skill developed and you want to recognize it in the immediate sense and then recognize it again later on a co-curricular record, that might be something you do. Again, learning outcomes and competencies tend to be recorded on a transcript and in a grade. And then work readiness and applied skills might be badged and then recognized on something like a student experience record. On the bottom right is that term LER or learner employment record. That's another way to think about gathering all of these data points and recognizing students all in one place for all of the things they might have encountered or accomplished on your campus along the way. The learner employment record, by definition, is portable and is owned by the student. So it's built on like blockchain technology, so it can carry between institutions. So if students are enrolled in multiple institutions, or they transfer, or they finish a degree and then they come back later, the learner employment record should follow them around, and they should be able to use that if that's what they're doing. Yeah, lots of ways to document. There's a kind of a question. Data model is based on skills learning or reflection, or focus more on student engagement. Yes, again, it's a good question, Enrique. Experiential learning focuses on all of it. It incorporates and integrates all of those parts of learning. So it's multiple domains. So it becomes a set of decisions. And this is what we saw in our research. Institutions make decisions about this. They say, okay, we're really interested in the retention part, so we're going to track the engagement part. And of course, we're interested in grades because that's what we do. So we're going to track the learning outcomes part. They may not track the reflection or the applied part. That's okay. That's a choice an institution has to make. Collecting data, managing data, these are real tasks. Somebody has to do the work. I'm not suggesting we know how to do that yet. We're getting insights to that, but and we're working on more publishing and analysis of our data to try to understand that. But yeah, different institutions value these things in different ways. They make choices about what to do with the information. I don't have a real clear like which one to start with. My guess is though, and as I've worked with specific campuses on this question, they're doing 2 or 3 of these things already in different ways, and they're not those different data collections aren't necessarily coordinated in a story or a narrative that we call experiential learning. So we might see, I imagine based on Will Miller's thing, again, I'm projecting a lot and hoping a lot for the next hour, but I imagine we might see some real examples of how this shows up on campus, and we might be able to think about these models together. But in terms of time, I want to make some time for SER is Student Experience Record. It's a version of the same. It's a kind of an aggregate of co-curricular and academic records. Yeah, no, great question. So we have a few minutes for questions. If you don't have other questions you want to ask aloud, we have some discussion questions. How does your role and point of view influence your view of experiential learning? And what experiential learning outcomes are you assessing and how? That's our starting point, but you can ask whatever question you want. Thanks for your time. This has been
thank you.
really engaging for us. Can experience, yeah, you want to
Did you
take
see
that?
the question in the chat? Okay. perfect.
Yeah. Can experiential learning be assessed using the summative format? I have to fill in some blanks there.
I would say, so if you're thinking about it summative format as an exam, maybe, or as a research paper,
Mhm.
or as something like that, then I think absolutely yes, you can do that. It takes a careful, it's a carefully designed assessment to ensure that you're aligning and you're getting what you want out of that. So yes, I think you can double dip. A lot of times we see formative stuff, but I think it's absolutely possible and happens all the time where we can do it in a summative way.
I'm putting a name in a response there. Kelly Millenbaugh is a biologist who wrote a lot about this, and I'm trying to remember the paper's names. It's been a bit, but I know this author, Kelly Millenbaugh, has written about this in biology education. So I know there's some good examples. Healthcare, yeah. Thank you, Debbie, for jumping in there. If there's other examples from your field, feel free to throw that in the chat. I appreciate that. But yeah. Again, discipline-based education research has a lot to say about this. So look in your areas for experiential learning and experiential education. Two sides of that coin. Other thoughts or comments or questions?
I just have, it's not really a question, well, it is regarding this, but if you would recommend one resource, like if somebody wanted to dive into experiential learning, what would be the first resource to go to?
That's a
I'm an instructional designer on my campus, so it's a selfish question.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean,
and it was unfair of me to put you on the spot because I know you probably have 1,000 resources coming in your head.
Yeah, I have a couple. I just had to think
about a narrowing question. What is
Absolutely.
Is it for the design of the experience? Is it, or is it for assessment of, or like, do you have a space that you'd love to jump into first?
I would say it's almost see all of the above. Like, if is there a 10,000 foot level resource of, okay, how could I get an overview of this before I'm ready to get into the weeds type of resource?
Yeah. So I'm going to put I don't know if it's a response or not, but it's in the chat. Jay Roberts's book, and I think it's 2016. It's around pedagogy and experiential education. It's a solid entry, generalist, sort of covers a lot of areas of teaching and learning. It doesn't get into assessment quite as deep as we're able to with some of the examples, but it's broad and inclusive for lots of kinds of education. If you're thinking about learning design, I think that's a helpful text from a learning design standpoint. Oh, you found it. Thanks, Patrice, for the link. Even better. Yeah, that's a solid entry there. Yeah, it's mostly focused in higher ed. So, there's a ton of this work in K-12, in camps, in outdoor ed. The Association for Experiential Education can help you with all of those spaces. The Society for Experiential Education focuses on higher ed. So AEE and SEE respectively, if you're looking for like organizations, but that book is a solid start, Amanda. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Bill, Robert do has a good question. How will you incorporate experimental learning into online courses?
Great question.
Yeah.
Again, start with Jay Roberts's book. That tends to be, so that's an excellent question. We're starting to think about that. Sorry that I had to scroll down. Marty Snyder is a good person to start with. let me put her name in the chat. She's been doing experiential learning and online mediated discussions. There's some interesting paper. I can dig up. I'm not sure how to send more references after the fact. You never know what questions are going to come. But that's a good reference there. Lee Graves Wolf is another person to think about. I'll put her name in the chat. Another author who writes about experiential learning in online spaces.
Bill,
Sorry, I'm not being more specific with specific resources about what they wrote, but some papers they've written in the last few years have covered this.
yeah, and I'm not going to offer her directly, but Erica, our research partner, is online doctoral students in nursing and has is doing an amazing job on the practical side of running experiential learning for those students. And if you want to get in touch with her, just let us know and we can put you in contact.
Or you can, yeah, Erica Lewis. I just put her name in there. You can look up her research in that space for sure. Yeah, great questions. Strategies for communicating the value of moving through this cycle and connecting abstract conceptualization to active experimentation, particularly motivating faculty to translate disciplinary learning to broader career outcomes with authentic assessment. Yeah, that's a great question, Bree. Bree Lauka in the chat. Connecting the knowledge to the experimentation, motivating faculty. So again, I'm just going to think about that broader question of you bring up authentic assessment. You also want to create authentic and engaging and really powerful experiences that students are excited about. So if you present a problem-based experience, problem-based learning class, that problem really needs to be something that is truly wild. If you want it to be engaging, and then you want the authentic assessment on the back end, like having that thing be really wild, and then ask students as part of their rubric grade to apply their disciplinary knowledge to that problem, right? And you put that in the requirement. So it's the application of their knowledge, right? So they become the subject matter expert. They become the knower of the solution, but they have to listen to the problem. And that might be represented by a client or a third party, or at the University of Toronto, Julia Allworth does this. She has design teams of student design teams solving problems of the university that different departments bring to them to solve, right? They have this client base in the institution, right? These might be internal problems that they're trying to solve. So I would say just really connect that authenticity in the design, create the rubric that asks students to do the work of delivering a solution, and then assess whether or not it worked, assess whether or not they took feedback, assess whether or not they incorporated the feedback. All of those are career skills, believe it or not, right? Like taking feedback, learning from your experience, learning from experts, et cetera, things like that. So when you say career skills, you might want to be very careful in the design. Again, work with your faculty around designing or teasing out what kind of career skills they think they might deliver in those spaces too. So you're working together to assess and point your assessment at a good space or a helpful space for everyone involved. Yeah, bring in the neuroscience. Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, great questions. It's interesting to be in the weeds. I would say if you're a person who lives at the course and assessment level, think about your ecosystem around you and think about how to share your data, right? Find your partners, see who might be a unknown consumer of your data, of this kind of outcome data. If you're an ecosystem player and you're looking at courses and be like, what's happening in experiential learning? Ask people about how their teaching delivers on certain kinds of outcomes. How does their teaching deliver on engagement or career, or, right? So we can challenge each other helpfully in order to get at these sort of messages and have these messages talk across our roles and our sort of expectations about what we do with those roles. I see we're at time. So Enrique, yeah.
Bill, thank you so much, because you do address, there's the ecosystems that are happening within the colleges. There's multiple colleges that assess at the student level, at the course level. And so, yeah, you have to know your ecosystem within your own institution.
Mhm.
Thanks so much, Bill. Appreciate and Patrice. Any questions? Further
Thank you
questions?
so much. Appreciate you all very
Awesome.
much.
Keep in touch. Here's our contact information. You can find us on LinkedIn.